everyone. My name is Nitya and I'm from Team Belong. The Belong Online Literature Festival of BOLF is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and a library for inclusive literature. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners. Our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not be possible. Now on to today's session. This session is on cultures of desire, perspectives from the humanities, with Madhavi, Menon, and Sanjaya Srivastava. The session will be moderated by Manjari Sahay. Manjari is a book club and library associate at Belong, a scholar of gender studies. She has previously worked as a consent trainer, a teaching assistant, and an editorial assistant.
Thanks, Nitya. You gave me a solid minute to hydrate with every beverage I have lying around me.
I'm glad.
But yeah, no, so I'm very excited for this session. I mean, it's a subject that I obviously am personally interested in. But I was thinking about this yesterday, I have a really funny relationship with the both of you, and it's almost the inverse of the other. Because Madhavi, with you, I mean, I was obviously your student for quite a while, and then after graduation, I ended up sort of have our own independent relationship, or so I like to think. And funnily enough, with Sanjay, he's someone I've known in a personal capacity for years. But you know, when you're a child, you don't quite clock people's accomplishments, like adults' accomplishments, or their work, and certainly not academic work. And I think it was only once I got older and became interested in gender and sexuality that I realized that this body of work existed. So in that sense, it's been sort of the opposite for the two of you. But moving on to more formal introductions, which of course I'm happy to do. Madhavi Menon is Professor of English and Director of the Center for Studies in Gender and Sexuality at Ashoka University. She writes on desire and queer theory. She is the author of Wanton Words, Rhetoric and Sexuality in English Renaissance Drama, Unhistorical Shakespeare, Queer Theory in Shakespearean Literature and Film, and Indifference to Difference on Queer Universalism. She is also the editor of Shakesquare, a queer companion to the complete works of Shakespeare. Her latest book, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, examines the many faces of desire in India. Sanjaya Srivastava is a British Academy Global Professor in the Department of Geography, University College London, and Professor of Sociology, Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. An anthropologist by training, his research spans over themes of masculinities and sexualities, consumerism, middle-class cultures, and new urbanism in India. Some of his publications include Constructing Post-Colonial India, National Character and the Doon School, Passionate Modernity, Sexuality, Class and Consumption in India, Entangled Urbanism, Slum, Gated Community, and the Shopping Mall in Delhi, and Gurgaon. He is co-editor of key themes in Indian sociology and histories of desire, sexualities, and culture in modern India. So those are the formal introductions, and without sort of spending too much time on formalities, I just sort of want to jump right into the questions, and of course, you two are best placed to speak about your work. So let me just begin by picking up on the title of the panel, Cultures of Desire. And I wanted to ask you in relation to that title, what does the phrase mean to you? What does it mean for desire to have cultures, or alternatively, for cultures to be desiring in your work? So if both of you could just answer that with reference to really any section of your body of work, that would be great. And I'll just sort of alternate the order in which I call upon you to do so. So Sanjay, would you like to go first?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Manjari, and it's good to be here with Madhavi. So I think there are three things. One is when you invoke the term culture, and especially culture of desire, then you're thinking about what does culture itself mean, right? Culture is something that is variable. It is changing. Historically, it's different. It's been different at some point in time. It's different now. So similarly then, if you add the words culture and desire, you juxtapose them, then also the notion of desire becomes a variable thing to look at, not a biological thing. At different points in time, it means different kinds of things. And most importantly, in connection to that, then you think about the fact that there may be no norms to desire. And that's very important. That's why I think thinking of cultures of desire is important. Secondly, it tells you something about the society within which that culture of desire is. What kind of society is it? What do people within it think about not just desire, but through it, about foreigners and intimates and, I don't know, about white people and black people. So it tells you something about the society itself. And finally, I think the really important point why we should use the term and what it means to me is that it also allows you to say something about certain, say, identities that people have. So for example, as has been pointed out, if you're thinking of cultures of desire, then it's much more interesting to ask, the interesting question, not so much, is homosexuality natural or can it be scientifically proven or not? That's the really interesting question to ask if you're thinking within the framework of cultural desire is, what is the meaning that that culture gives to homosexuality? Everything else is really irrelevant because at some point, if someone says, look, science can prove that it's natural and normal, at some other point, science will also prove it's complete opposite. But the question you ask is, what is the meaning that that culture gives to that form of desire? Then it becomes a much more productive question. Then you can argue politically. And I think this is how I understand as an anthropologist, why culture is a really important term to use when you're using this term desire. It allows you to do these kinds of things, negotiate and maneuver your way through all the kind of biological ideas of desire and what is right and what is wrong. So it allows you to get away from normative thinking and allows you to say, well, what's the meaning that people give to this? And why do people give this meaning to that form of desire? And then you can argue against or for. Right? So that's why I think, at least for me, this is what it means. And that's why it's an interesting way to think about desire and identities.
Thanks. I like what you said about, how thinking about desire as having cultures or as being cultural allows you to sort of argue politically. And we're going to explore that further in the upcoming questions. What does it mean to argue politically? How might we do so in relation to desire? Madhavi, you'd like to go next?
Happily. Thanks, Sanjay. Thanks, Manjari. Thank you all for having us here and for having this session, which, I, in my biased manner, think is a very important session to have. So I'm glad we're having these conversations. I think the sort of first thing I would think of when I hear the phrase cultures of desire is that I am so grateful that culture is plural rather than singular, that there are cultures of desire. And of course, I would also pluralize the desire and make it cultures of desires, because the one thing singularly that we know about desire is that it's not and never singular, and that it's always multiple. And so one of the things, especially at this political moment, to go back to what you were saying, Manjari, when we are being increasingly taught to think about everything and not just desire, but desire, since it's our bailiwick right now, taught to think about desire as being singular, as being normative, as being majoritarian, as being then in some respects pejorative, and minoritarian on other fronts. When we're being taught to think of desire as having one right way and one wrong way, it's very useful to remember that desires are always plural and their histories are always plural, and never have they been hegemonic. So there has never been a moment in time or a moment in thought or a moment in behavior in which there has only been one time, one thought, and one behavior. And I think it's useful for us to keep that in mind. And the other reason I sort of like the phrase cultures of desire is that because it sort of gets us out of a certain trap, I think, that we still tend to fall into when we use the word sexuality, for instance. Because we think about sexuality as an orientation. We think about sexuality as an identity. Whereas the reason why desire is a more difficult term, is a sort of harder term to pin down, is precisely because it seems to evade and elude these kinds of identitarian categories. And so in that sense, then, it's more sort of useful to think about desire in relation to cultures, because if we're emphasizing a certain kind of pluralism, if we're emphasizing a certain kind of multiplicity, then desire, to my mind, seems to be more sort of productive as a way of thinking, rather than sort of thinking about sexuality and perhaps even thinking about gender.
Great. And certainly both of your most recent books use the word desire in their titles. So my next question, picks up on something you were saying, Madhavi, which is that, there were these diverse cultures in India, and are diverse cultures in India. But both of you write, about pre-colonial India and how it was home to perhaps more diverse cultures than exist now, or certainly there was something about our ability to see that diversity that was sharper, more capacious, more complex. And that something changed with colonialism. So I was hoping both of you could talk about what changed with colonialism and what is the threat that this kind of colonial modernity, right, which lives on in the form of a nation state that was born through colonialism, what that colonial modernity means for India's sexual cultures or cultures of desire. So Madhavi, would you like to take that first?
Sure. I mean, it's a huge question. It's an important question. It's a question that one can approach, from multiple angles and multiple perspectives. But let me just sort of begin by saying that sort of unequivocally, the British were horrified by what they found in India sexually. There's no way of gainsaying that. There's no way of softening that blow, because it really, I think, felt to them like a blow, and felt to them like multiple blows, because there was nothing here. And I also want to add an addendum that a lot of British people who came to India came precisely for those blows, which is to say, they came here to escape a certain kind of puritanical model that had become the normative back home for them. But for your garden variety colonial official and your garden variety ruler, the sort of sexual cultures and desires in India were absolutely horrifying. And they were horrifying, not necessarily because they led to disease or murder or crime or anything, even though they made those individual arguments in relation to individual sexualities, and maybe we can talk about that later. It was horrifying precisely because there did not seem to be a one-size-fits-all attitude. There did not seem to be a sense, or rather there did not seem to be a consensus among Indians that there was only one position in which one could have sex, and that it was always the missionary position, right? That was always about the man on top. It was always about strictly defined roles between men and women, and that sex was always and only about reproduction. In fact, if we think about India's current craze with reproduction, I would say that too is sort of directly owing to a certain kind of colonial line of descent that inextricably put sex and reproduction together. When, for instance, as you might know, as big a text as the Kama Sutra never once mentions reproduction. And it's always talking about sexual desire, pleasure, unpleasure. So the idea that there is not a single consensus, the idea that there isn't this one narrative that everyone either subscribes to or is made to subscribe to, came as a big shock, which is why you see a slew of initiatives, most fundamentally from the law, which we continue to use in the so-called post-colonial state, right? The sort of criminal law procedure, the Indian Penal Code, we continue to inherit from the British and have used that. So they sort of started making a whole bunch of laws to literally outlaw certain desires and certain sexual configurations. There was, of course, an entire attack on individual cultures, both politically and socially. I like to think that the sort of attack on Awadh was in microcosmic form, the political, social, sexual attack against what India stood for. Because Awadh for them was the ultimate in what they used to call decadence. Men used to dress as women. There was sort of multiple women attached to multiple men. Concubinage was very much a respected occupation. they were absolutely horrified by this. And by men dressing as women, I mean the Nawabs themselves, not just sort of commoners or anything of the kind. And so the conquest of Awadh was in many ways for the British, in microcosmic form, the conquest of a certain kind of sexual decadence and political dissidence that was India for them. And so what we are directly living right now, what we are directly inhabiting right now, is the consequence of the horror that the British felt and all the steps they took to mitigate that horror for themselves. What they have done by mitigating the horror for themselves, of course, is create all kinds of horrors for us. And the tragic part is that many, many of us seem perfectly happy and comfortable inhabiting those horrors right now, rather than pushing back against them.
Yeah. Sanjay?
Okay, yeah, I think Madhavi has covered, I think, most of the key points. So I'll just stick to a few. One is, of course, when the English, when the British, when they came to India, they saw what Madhavi describes. And one of the most significant things about colonialism is, of course, the act of distancing. So if you are exactly the same as the people who wish to colonize, then what is the justification, if you need a justification at all? So I think one of the things about colonialism's trajectory towards producing, was saying that this is a strange place, is precisely because, of course, there were many English men who were part of gay culture, homosexual culture. But for them to be seen as exactly what was happening in India, for example, would have been to equate the colonizer with the colonized. So that is very fundamental. How do you distance? And I think sexuality and desire was one of the grounds for the distancing procedures that happens during colonialism, and hence it becomes, India comes to be seen as strange and weird and all those kinds of things. So that's what is fundamental to any colonial process. And of course, then you have the rise of a particular kind of industrialization, industrial capitalism, which requires a particular family form. You know, you have children who have to go to school, who have to be trained to be good workers, etc. And that requires, whether it's actually, this is what people practice or not, at least the public articulation of saying that you need certain kinds of families, heterosexual families, right? And then there's the entire public school culture within England, which of course is home to very strong non-heterosexual cultures, but promotes a certain kinds of heterosexual masculine culture. Because again, this act of distancing. So if you're going to rule people, then you need to be seen as the man. And those people are the people who are not men, as it were, effeminate, if you like. And I think finally, I want to say one of the things that also happens is that a lot of this production of India as this strange place of strange sexuality and strange desire also has to do, I think, with the Hindu-Muslim issue. You know, because a lot of and this links to an older Judeo-Christian hostility towards Islam. And in India, when the colonial rulers arrive, they find, or they identify Muslims as particularly more, as it were, in inverted commas, deviant than Hindus, right? And hence, that is a part of the tradition where Hindu culture comes to be seen as superior to Muslim culture, because although in general people say, you know, all Indians, all people who live here are slightly deviant sexually in terms of desire, it is Muslims who are more, because that links to an older European history of the relationship with the Islamic world, which is then transposed into India. So I think all these kinds of different developments then produce a certain idea of the strangeness of, you know, the abnormality of desire and sexuality in India, and how you need a normal culture of desire and sexuality. And I think these are all linked, but I think, you know, that they have a prehistory, which is a European history in different kinds of ways, in terms of religion, in terms of how do you produce a group of rulers who have to be seen as different. Why? Because they're very same. And that is a problem for colonialism. And that's how I think these processes are linked processes, and then produce this idea of abnormal cultures of desire, abnormal cultures of gender, and abnormal cultures of sexuality.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, my next question is something that you sort of already alluded to, Sanjay, which is, you know, something that I struggle with a little bit is, you know, how do we both say that desire or desires in India were altered by colonialism, without making the claim that there exists such a thing as, authentic sexual cultures. And, I can, of course, list what I see as some of the potential problems with claims to authenticity. I just think it would be much more interesting if you both did that. So I guess a two-part question would be, what would be the problem of making an argument around authenticity, or why it may not be a problem? And then sort of how do we go about doing that either way?
Yeah.
So Sanjay, would you like to go first?
Yeah. Okay. So, like quite often when you have NGOs who work on sexuality in India, they will often begin the report by referring to, ancient books and saying that this is Indian sexuality. Or these are the ways of, or there's the rasa theory, for example, which is correct, but it's not entirely correct, right? Because authenticity assumes a kind of continuity, that there's historical continuity, and that things happen one particular point in time, and those are the ways of believing and being and doing that people continue to embody. That's number one. I think it also then suggests that if something departs from what is seen as authentic, it is not Indian. And these are two kind of really strong issues when we think about authenticity, because it is not necessary to think that that is something specifically Indian without saying that it is authentically Indian, because something that's specifically Indian also keeps changing, and with thousands of years of contact with the rest of the world, with at least 200-300 years of intense contact with the West, how do we say, so, it's not necessary for us to even say that whether, for example, homosexuality, for example, is authentically Indian or not. Because quite often people will say, well, it says in this particular text, it gives you some glimpses into ancient Indian homosexuality. Well, that is not, it's not a very useful argument, because if it is used as the fundamental bedrock of an argument, if it's used as one part of the argument, it's fine. Because any form of fundamentalism refers to texts. We need also to think about the customs that people have, which take us away from ideas of authenticity, to say that hundreds of years of contact with other cultures mean that what is Indian is something that has developed in relationship with other cultures. It will continue to develop in relationship to other cultures, and it takes us away once again from notions of a norm. That there is some kind of norm, or that something that was not there 50 years ago in India and is there now is somehow inauthentic, or these people are not Indian in any sense. Because some of the problems with the argument, the authenticity argument, the problem is not that you're saying that there's some ancient text that says that this form of design is valid. The problem is if you suggest that that is the most significant part of the argument. The problem is never using as one part of the argument. But authenticity argument becomes the argument as the bedrock kind of argument on which everything that you proceed from. So these are some of the ways of thinking about the idea of authenticity in this particular field, but also in any particular field of culture. I think I'll leave it at that.
Madhavi?
I think the minute you sort of, I agree with everything Sanjay said, the minute you pluralize cultures and histories, what you're immediately throwing out of the window is authenticity. Because there is no way, in fact, that anyone ever uses the word authenticity in its plural form. Because the minute you say authenticities, you're actually defeating the purpose of the word and the purpose of the idea. But the minute you pluralize something, then you're automatically removing it from the realm of authenticity. And so these two are always and forever at odds with one another, which is why desires actually can never be authentic. I mean, they're not authentic in any individual's lifespan. Why would they be authentic across sort of great swathes of civilizational time or historical time and geographical And as I've said many times before, the very idea of what is India itself is constantly changing. I mean, even right now, we're in the process of having our map being rearranged according to some people. So what counts as India and what doesn't is, as it is, an extremely, I think, futile project to sort of ascertain right now and then retrospectively impose onto the past. Because the very borders of India have always been changing, which means the very borders of what does and does not count as whose desire and desires is also always changing. And so this idea of authenticity is just completely, I mean, it's a nice enough word. You want it if you're buying, if you're interested in buying, I don't know, gold jewelry or whatever it is that you want to do. But I don't think it has any bearing whatsoever to do with culture or politics and certainly not with desire. And so the sense of going back in time should actually take you further away from authenticity rather than bringing you closer to it. Which is why it is so ironic and so, if it weren't so tragic, laughable, to see this word and its cognates being sort of swirling around in the political stratosphere here in India, because it seems to be the sort of one word access, your one word, Zoom password to getting some kind of political success, right? That if you say this is authentically X, then you've made it, and then you just spend the rest of your life defending to the death that authenticity. But the minute you sort of have some sense of history, the minute you have some sense of a sort of longue durée, the minute you have some sense of sort of multiple cultures and narratives and tales and desires all sort of coming together, colluding, colliding, changing, shaping, reshaping one another, you actually see that there is no such thing as the authentic. And I think what we actually do need to reflect on is the current moment that we're inhabiting that makes us seem so attracted to the concept of authenticity. Why is it that after thousands of years spent seemingly quite happily and merrily in the stew of corruption, as seen by, the sort of outside gaze, why is it now that we seem to have this burning ambition to be authentic, to sort of track down the authentic, to inhabit the authentic, and then to police anybody else, sometimes brutally, who does not in fact fit whatever we call the bill of authenticity? And this very much, goes back even to sort of apartheid era laws in South Africa, where sort of one drop of non-white blood makes you colored, right? And so we're dealing at that level of absolute grossness when we talk about authenticity. We're dealing with that level of unthinking. We're dealing with that level of absolutely brutal ignorance when we talk about authenticity. And again, this is not to say that things did not or did really happen. That's not the same thing. But it is to say that whenever one thing happens, multiple things happen as well. And that we have to, in fact, have some awareness, knowledge, desire to think about these multiple things and think about how they might interact with each other. And so, for every assertion that you make, there's also going to be a series of counter assertions that you also have to be able to take on board. And so authenticity for me is one of those, red rags to a bull. It just sort of makes zero sense to me, especially when we're thinking about desire.
Thanks for that, both of you. That definitely helps me come up with a kind of response when I'm faced with those two seemingly contradictory.
I just quickly add something.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, if I add another to that?
Of course, go ahead, yeah.
So, okay, I think the other thing about authenticity is it's linked to two quite specific historical factors. One is nationalism, right? So once nationalism comes into being, you need to define what is authentically Indian, what is authentically French or German or British or whatever. And the secondly, its rise, I think, is also linked to globalization. So when it is globalization that comes to define what is local, the two are completely linked. So once you have globalization, people start saying, well, what is local about this? And what is local is this, that we are authentically this. Ironically, it's a rise of globalization that actually leads to more localization. It's not that two are completely separate processes. And I think these are also things we should think about when you're thinking about what it is, the authenticity. Why do people argue for authenticity? What is the history of authenticity?
Yeah. Yeah. I think historicizing authenticity is certainly interesting and important as well.
I mean, a prime example of that, of course, is this entire phenomenon of yoga, which is sort of my particular bugbear. Because, you know, the only comment that has been made about anybody's physical or mental health during these months of lockdown has been stay at home and do yoga, as though that is the panacea for everything. And as you know, a few years ago, when the current government sort of decided to send yoga instructors into every corner of the world to assert an authentic Indian tradition, they rejected every single application by Muslim yoga instructors, precisely because yoga is now being reclaimed as this authentic Hindu tradition, and it's neither of those things. But of course, it's one of these things that we take completely for granted without questioning right now.
Okay, great. So now moving into a slightly different aspect of your works, you both also write quite differently about the relationship between desire and gender in your books. And I was wondering if you could, you know, detail for us, with the help of maybe some examples, what is sort of the intimate, complex relationship between gender and desire in the Indian context. So Madhavi, I think you're due to go next, right? I'm almost losing track of.
I'm happy for you to lose track and for Sanjay to go first, I must say. Because, you know, Manjari, your questions are getting more and more sort of capacious and complex, and which is wonderful, of course, for you, but less so, I think, for us.
We're fine on time. Yeah, we're fine on time. So we're happy.
No, that's okay. You see, I'm actually really glad you asked that question, because often gender and sexuality are seen as being synonymous, or if not synonymous, are seen as being causal, which is to say, if you have a particular gender, if you've been assigned a particular gender, you will also then have a particular sexuality that will follow upon the heels of that gender. And of course, in the sort of commonplace understanding of that, if you have been assigned a female, you are going to have heterosexual desire for a man. If you've been assigned male, you're going to have heterosexual desire for a woman. That to me is a danger of linking gender and sexuality, because it seems to imply a certain kind of causality. And it is sort of, I think, gives short shrift to both the realms of gender and sexuality. So this is something that I just want to sort of caution us against, because we often, and perhaps with the best of intentions, tend to conflate these two terms, because, as I'm about to say now, in many ways, of course, there are overlaps between the two. In many ways, of course, there is an intense and intrinsic and deep and important relationship between gender and sexuality, which is why, of course, we can even use phrases like same-sex desire or homosexuality, you know, coming from the very idea of homo as sameness, as opposed to hetero as differentness. The idea of the same gender being attracted to one another, or different genders being attracted to one another. So terminologically, there's a close relationship between gender and sexuality as well. The problem with sort of thinking about gender, so okay, let me just sort of backtrack a little bit. In some ways, people are much more comfortable acquiescing to the idea that sexuality is fluid. People are much more comfortable thinking through the possibilities that desire might actually be multiple and various. People are far less comfortable with thinking about gender as being fluid. People are far less sanguine thinking about gender as something that might change, which is why you have a whole host of transphobia, for instance, in the world today as well. The idea that your gender can change is somehow hitting close to, I don't know, some authentic notion of the self or authentic notion of identity that a lot of people have difficulty with. What's interesting to me, since you asked about sort of the situation on the ground in India, sort of multiple traditions in India, what's interesting to me, and this is sort of a story I tell in my book as well, is about the birth of psychoanalysis in India. And early in the 20th century, Girindra Shekhar Bose, who heads the first psychoanalytic society out of Calcutta, and is a big fan, as most psychoanalysts were, at least then, if not now, of Sigmund Freud, writes a letter to Freud and says, you know, I'm a big fan of yours. I think you're wonderful, brilliant, all that stuff. And I completely appreciate the emphasis that you place on the importance of the Oedipus complex in the development of psychoanalysis. Now, for Freud, the Oedipus complex names a certain phase that he says every child goes through, but of course with particular emphasis on the male child. The Oedipus complex names a phase in which you have to be weaned away from attraction to your mother, and weaned away from that, if you're a boy, in order to look at other women as sources of sexual pleasure. Which is to say, your gender has to be oriented in a particular direction towards the other gender by also distancing yourself from your mother, who ostensibly belongs to the same gender that you're meant to be attracted to. So it's a complex situation, but Freud basically says little boys are so attracted to their mothers that unless you threaten them with some dire punishment, they're not going to let go of their mother. And so the punishment that the Oedipus complex threatens the little boy with is that you're going to be castrated, that you're going to lose your privileges as a boy, you're going to lose your gender if you do not give up on your mother. And so Girindra Shekhar Bose writes to Freud and says, you know, this makes perfect sense, but it makes perfect sense perhaps in the European society of Vienna in which you live. Because, he says, one of the things I have seen treating both European and Indian patients in India is that while my European patients, it's very easy to chart the aftermath of the Oedipus complex in their psychic development, I see it less so among my Indian patients. And he said, and my thinking on that is because, and this might be perhaps, because we in Indian cultures and civilizations and geographies have perhaps always inhabited a more fluid relationship to our gender than perhaps Viennese society has done. And by that he meant that we are heir to, that we have multiple histories across religious traditions, across literary traditions, across historical movements, in which the idea of a man being or becoming a woman is so unremarkable or unworthy of comment that it forms the actual stuff of the tale, the history, the culture that is being narrated. And so to go back to something that I said earlier about the Nawabs of Awadh, dressing up as women in labor giving birth on their peers' birthdays is something that the entire court used to attend, right? It was a ritual that the whole court used to attend. There was absolutely no shame attached to it. Similarly, if you look at a lot of Krishna Bhakts, for instance, who dress up as Radha in order to sort of be worthy of Krishna's love. And, you know, there are multiple examples of this kind. And so Girindra Shekhar Bose says, you know, there are so many causeways in India in which gender does not run along a prescribed stream of being, that perhaps the Oedipus complex cannot be instituted with as much force because the threat to castrate a male child to make him a woman does not register, in fact, as a threat. Does not register, in fact, as a form of deprivation, because across these traditions, this kind of castration is equated with greater rather than lesser sexual desire and pleasure. So in fact, you are changing from a man to a woman in order to heighten your sexual experience. If the threat for the little boy in the Oedipus complex is that your sexuality is going to be eroded because your gender is eroded, you can see that causal relationship that I was talking about, right? If your gender goes down, your sexuality goes down. Whereas in the Indian context that we're talking about, your gender can change and your sexual pleasure goes up. And so there is an inverse relationship between the two. And so I just think it's sort of fascinating to think about, to go back to something Sanjay was saying earlier as well, the sort of different geographies and cultures in which desire gets narrated so differently at different points in time. And for me, sort of that capaciousness is something that we are so under threat of, and I'm being optimistic here because some people would say we've already lost it, but we are so under threat of losing. And again, that doesn't make sense to me because I would assume that more is better than less, right? More ways of being in the world is surely more fun than fewer ways of being in the world. but perhaps that's just me.
Thanks, Madhavi. Sanjay?
Okay, so I'll just work through some specific examples, and I primarily want to link, for example, gender and desire to thinking about masculinity, right? And masculinity, masculinity, the ways of being men, the culture of masculinities, of course, has a very strong influence on desire. And this is an influence not just within heterosexual relationships, for example, as my first case, but also within non-heterosexual relationships, where some forms of masculine culture, heterosexual masculine culture, get reproduced within these other non-heteronormative contexts. So in many non-heterosexual relationships, there is a man in the relationship and there's a woman in the relationship, right? So often gender and desire have a specific relationship. In this instance, masculinity has a specific relationship to how all forms of desire are in fact produced, all forms of intimacies are produced. And that's why I say that ironically, even in non-heterosexual contexts where you would think that the influence of heterosexual masculinity would not apply to the same extent, you have the same structures of intimacy and affect and desire being reproduced. That's one way of thinking about the relationship between gender and desire. The other would be, say, something like, if you think about, again, I'm sticking with masculinity just to be more concrete. If you're thinking, for example, about the cultural traditional wrestling flow, right? Which is about a certain form of masculine being, which valorizes very significantly the idea of celibacy. Right? Celibacy as the most significant aspect of being a man. And hence, that also produces certain ideas of how desire should be looked at. Why desire is bad? How do you control desire, for example? So that masculine culture, which comes to us, say, from the Pushti tradition, from the traditional Akha tradition, where celibacy is valued completely to the exclusion of non-celibacy, whereas in Hindu culture, at least where the Western tradition comes from, it's not that celibacy is valued exclusively. Right? Celibacy is seen one aspect of desire, but here it's valued in the wrestling tradition. It has become valued for a number of reasons. You know, the rise of nationalism and how wrestling becomes a part of national culture in the late 19th century. So there again, that form of masculinity produces certain ideas about desire. Another example, if you think about, I guess most of you will be familiar. She's not around. She doesn't act anymore. So if you think about the classic Bollywood film from till about the 1970s, there used to be the heroine, but also a vamp. Right? That vamp figure is no longer there. The most famous vamp of them all was, of course, Helen. Now, Helen was also produced through a certain idea. The idea of Helen, if you like, was produced through a certain idea of masculine desire. That proper masculinity should only desire certain kinds of women. So although Helen was there in films, ultimately, Helen, a persona on screen, had to die. Helen had to die because there is no other way of dealing with that kind of desire except to kill that desire. And that also then comes from a certain masculine notion of the desire that is proper. So Helen was there as an improper desire, but she was not the desire that converted ever into a long-term relationship. So either Helen was reformed, she was sent to an ashram, or she had to die. Usually she had to die. So there are some ways in which, there are specific ways in which I think gender identities, specific gender identities have structured desire in the Indian context, leading to certain ideas about the truth of sexuality, the truth of desire, that there's certain kinds of true desires and certain false desires. So if you look specifically in our popular culture, for example, if you look or in fact, all these kind of detective novels, pulp fiction novels in Hindi, which produce a certain ideas of desire, and that's a very important resource. Then it's quite interesting to think about how masculinity, a certain kind of masculine culture, has produced certain ideas of desire about the woman who is the proper object of desire, about proper men and their proper desire, and about the the true desire, the truth of desire, the truth of sexuality, if you like. So I think there are some other ways which we can think about ethnographically, empirically, about how the relationship between gender and desire, and even, as I say, the manner in which heterosexual masculinity also structures non-heterosexual relationships, where again you have some that reproduction of the man in the relationship and quite often the woman in that relationship. Even there's a category called men who have sex with men, and even in MSM context, you have although these are non-heterosexual relationships, you have a man, a specific name for that, and you have a woman-like figure, and there's a specific different term for that. So there's some of the ways I think in which masculinity as a gender structures desire, structures affect, and structures ideas of intimacy.
Thanks. Okay, great. So I'm going to move on to my last question before I start taking audience questions. So this question is about methodology. I know the subtitle of this talk is called Perspectives from the Humanities, but of course the humanities is a wide range of disciplines. And Madhavi, your training is in English. Sanjay, your training is as an anthropologist. And so I was wondering if you could say a bit about, what are some of the methods of analysis that you mobilize in your studies of desire, and what do they make possible for you or your analysis? I think it's you this time, Sanjay.
Well, most of my work is through field work, although that's not exclusively. Everyone does now a mixture. I think there are older hard and fast rules between what anthropologists did and what English literature person did. I think they're much more blurred now. But still, I would say that I guess a lot of my work is still field work based. One of the things about doing field work around this topic is that it's impossible to ask a direct question. You can't ask a person in a conversation, people you've never met before, and you're primarily meeting for the purposes of research, to ask a direct question. No one will, that's the kind of rapport that you have with friends and people you've known for a long period of time, and you can talk to them about these things. But methodologically, if you're doing research in this area, you never ask the question that you think would most directly ask. In the Indian context, I think it's much more easier for people to talk about love, because love has a very specific trajectory primarily through Bollywood, right? That love is seen as something that is cut off from desire. So people find it uncomfortable to talk about desire. People find it very easy to talk about love, because desire is seen as something that's tainted. Desire is seen as something that spoils love. So actually, in most fieldwork conversations, it's easy to broach the topic of love, because it has almost a sacred status. Love and quite often not just love, but different forms of intimacy. It could be intimacy among men. That's also, so you start with that because quite often when you're talking to men, you realize that what in conversations, what men value quite often much higher and much more strongly is intimacy among men. So they may have women as partners, but intimacy among men is very strongly valued. But generally, I think that people find it much more easier to talk about things like love because of this negative connotation that is given to desire as something that spoils what is. There's a notion of kind of pure love, and I think it's not a very new idea. Certainly, many of our folk tales also had this notion of love, but I think it's been translated into a mass culture phenomenon through throughout the 20th century, through cinema, through comic books, through chapbooks, through novels and novellas and things like that. So, in terms of my own research, I almost never begin with asking the question that is most relevant to my research. You almost begin with almost anything else. It could be even about food, or it could be about something else, and then eventually you get to the kind of question that you ask. But of course, as I said, it's important. I mean, no one does anthropology, no one does sociology. Like no one works in the present without also being a historical sociologist or historical anthropologist. And that's not possible anymore because, as we've been discussing throughout this conversation, it is not possible for any idea to be looked at as anything other than having a history. Right? So even though I do work in the present, my work has to then, my present material that I get from speaking to people, it obviously has to be contextualized through archival sources, through what others have written, what historians have written, what people who have analyzed texts have written from various theoretical perspectives. So it's really a mixture of these two. Although, I mean, I should say that once people in conversational context, once you get people to start talking about themselves, they begin with being hesitant, but once they start, it's not a problem at all. Everyone wants to talk about their intimate lives. Everyone wants to talk about their experiences because, well, we all want to have a sense that what we are is important. That's almost fundamental to fieldwork. I know will talk to you. Everyone obviously wants to be valued. Everyone wants to know that their own self, not a big public famous self, but their own personal self, which may have no big famous public presence, is also of significance. I think people actually love talking to anthropologists because it is the task of the listener to build us a story about society from individual lives. And I think once people have that sense, and that's what we're trying to do, then people are really happy to talk because, frankly, no one wants to die unnoticed. I mean, that's the basis of, I think, a lot of fieldwork in anthropology. That why is an individual important? And once people have that sense, then people open up and they talk about all kinds of things.
Yeah, Madhavi.
Well, I mean, as you just said, Manjari, I'm a professor of English. I'm a student of English literature. And so what I do is that old-fashioned thing, which is I read. And which sort of, we're doing less, we seem to be doing less and less of that now. But I'm also trained as a queer theorist. So I read in perhaps specific ways or particular ways, because there are, of course, multiple ways of reading. And let me just sort of clarify that when I say reading, I don't necessarily mean a printed page or a printed text. I mean the sort of developing the skills of reading situations, phenomena, histories, politics, cultures, films, and of course, books that you actually read. But without books that you actually read, you can't, I would say, develop that skill of reading. So I read in a very particular way. I read sort of, across disciplines. I completely agree with Sanjay that siloing disciplines is the most sort of antithetical, anti-intellectual thing to do. So I read across disciplines, I read across times and histories as well. But I also sort of read, I like to call it my sort of Dade Ishqiya mode of reading. This is a sort of popular Bombay film called Dade Ishqiya with Madhuri Dixit and Huma Qureshi. And I call it the Dade Ishqiya form of reading because, of course, the idea of dadeness of 1.5 involves reading in between. Reading in between what is out there ostensibly presented for us to see, reading in between the cracks, reading the cracks sort of behind a facade that seems to be smooth and singular, reading for things that don't always leap out at you, but that are sort of lurking in the interstices of any phenomenon, any idea, which is to say, reading like you are not going to take anything as the truth unless you're actually able to read around it, within it, through it, under it, and over it. And so this, of course, is a time-consuming process. It requires a lot of patience, which is perhaps why it's falling increasingly out of practice and out of favor. But to my militant mind, there is no other way in which to develop this skill.
Right. So now I'm going to, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pose one question each to the two of you. So there's a specific question for Madhavi and a specific question for Sanjay. I'm trying to figure out which one of you is dying to go first. But Madhavi, let's give you a second to catch your breath and take this to Sanjay instead.
Yeah.
So this question says, you talk about the idea of deviancy and the British legacy of Islamic desire as the British legacy of basically making Islamic desire seem deviant or labeling it as deviant. What does it look like to decolonize modern Indian desire from those sort of British notions of deficiency, that there's some sort of either deviance or there's a lack? And I think this is perhaps in particular relation to Muslim desire, or what the desire of Muslims has been made out to be.
As I said, I mean, as Madhavi said, in terms of one of the earlier questions, it's a very big question. I think one thing to remember is to think about that when we speak, although the British spoke about Muslim desire as different from Hindu desire, and that's what they wanted to do, because they had their own axe to grind and longer history of the relationship, the Judeo-Christian relationship with the Islamic world. But in the Indian context, I think one of the ways of thinking about this is to say that, of course, there's a great overlap between Muslims and Hindus and what each were doing in each class, right? And that's a fundamental step. In fact, what an elite Muslim Nawab, for example, had much less in common with a poor Muslim than he had with someone of his own background, a Hindu zamindar or talukadar in Awadh, right? So there was great overlap that we should begin by saying, and it's particularly, of course, important for the present, is the overlap between the so-called Muslim ways of doing, Hindu ways of doing, within specific socioeconomic context. And that's a first step. In fact, Nawab, for example, the Nawabs actually didn't like all kinds of Muslims. They actually thought the Afghans were really barbaric, that it is the Persian culture that was much more superior. And you read it in various books. Right? They actually looked down looked down on the Afghan Muslims. So that first step is to break down that there was some monolithic Muslim culture which could be counterposed to monolithic Hindu culture. And then you would have a shared notion of desire, shared notion of cultures of sexuality, shared notion of cultures of affect and intimacy, which is I think the first step. If you really are interested in using culture to break down some of the older ideas of deviancy, and who was more deviant than the other, and to look at the history of these terms, and then to say that this heritage is not specific to one particular community, that it was a very common heritage within a specific socioeconomic group, and that is where we should proceed from. That also helps us break down, it helps us think of intimacy and desire, what is right and what is wrong, what is normative, what is aberrant. It diffuses these kind of categories and allows us to say, well, if these so-called fundamental identities like Hindus and Muslims weren't themselves so monolithic, then maybe these other ways of doing things, if these two apparently so different communities actually weren't so different, then and they had this shared culture of intimacy and desire, then maybe there wasn't this norm that there's a good sexuality and bad sexuality. So if you proceed from that, then we get to a world of thinking whereby you think of the fact that people who may have had very specifically different religious beliefs and yet acted similarly. So if there's no norm there, what exactly is the norm that we should be following? As long as it is not a practice which you can define is harmful in some ways. Right? And of course, you can have a conversation on what is harmful. It's not a practice that harms someone. And I think that's one way of thinking about how to get away from the older ideas of being deviant, how to get away from older ideas of having a norm, and to, as it were, sort of become part of a contemporary present where what it is to, where we think of practice as something that should guide us in thinking about what is normal, not what textbooks tell us, what a particular ancient religious book says, but practice. What do people actually do, and what is the meaning that we give to that particular practice, and why do we give this meaning? And once we think about this, then I think we can get away from ideas of what is normal, why is this called aberrant, And why is it, I think finally, why is it we feel anxious about certain practices? At least it's about our anxieties, right? And then once we begin to understand why someone feels anxious, then you begin to understand ideas of discrimination, what is at stake in being anxious about a particular practice. I think that's one way of thinking about getting away from ideas of older norms and deviancy.
Yeah.
And just to sort of comment on a couple of the words used in the question, I think the word lack or deficiency was used. If I was
a few different words, yeah.
Hearing that rightly, and actually those are completely the opposite words, because for if anything, Muslim desire for the British always connoted excess, and it was always the excessiveness that needed to be curbed and needed to be sort of brought in line. Which is why, as Sanjay said, you have the simultaneous creation of both religious identity as monolithic and sexual identity as monolithic as well.
Right. Madhavi, the question for you is, again, a big question. We're dealing in big questions. I think we're used to it now. It's been an hour. So this is a question about how might we distance ourselves from notions of sexuality that are tied to ideas of reproduction, and reproduction is tied to ideas of having a uterus. So what are some ways of thinking or being that sort of signal for you the possibility of non-reproductive sexualities?
Yeah, I mean it's hard, especially when at every street corner now you have the sort of lure of IVF clinics, especially in Delhi, which which really seems sort of criminal to me, not only because of the hardships they impose on female bodies as always, but also, it's a roaring business and people actually pay a lot of money for this. And this obsession with reproduction seems to only have grown over the years, which is frightening, because one would have thought if one looked at the sort of the way in which population in the world was exploding, one would think, oh, maybe one should have fewer children. But there is such a deep-seated narcissistic desire to pass on one's genes. I mean, really, if you pause to think about it, do we really think we have genes fabulous enough to pass on forever and ever? Unfortunately, the answer for most people would be yes. And that is a scary thought. And I don't want to dwell for too long on that, because that's fundamentally what is happening. But the politics of reproduction, which I think the question lays out very nicely, the politics of reproduction is a politics of heteronormativity. It's a politics of productivity, which of course leads to reproductivity. It's a politics that then works its way back to naturalizing gender. Because if you think reproduction is the goal of sex, then you need to have certain biologies in place in order to enable that reproduction. If you need to have certain biologies in place, that means you need to have sperm and you need to have an egg. If you need to have sperm and you need to have an egg, then you need to have categories called male and female. And if you have to have that, then every child that's born has to be categorized as one or the other. So then you will know who to marry in order to reproduce. Right? So it sort of goes around in this big loop, each part of that cycle normalizing retrospectively or prospectively the other parts of that cycle. So it's an extremely pernicious way of thinking. I mean, reproduction in this sense is an extremely pernicious way of inhabiting the world, because what it does primarily is naturalize systems of behavior and being that are nothing more than imposed and assigned. So there is no getting away from a certain kind of heterosexist bias in relation to reproduction. Now, this is not to say that non-heterosexual people don't want to have children. Unfortunately, all the time. And so but to think of non-heterosexual people having children as being liberating is actually not the case at all, because I think you're still caught up in that cycle of an investment in reproduction, which I find actually quite pernicious. So how to see alternatives, how to think about sexuality as perhaps being distinct from reproduction. One is, of course, as I said, to think that we are, in fact, we sort of live among cultures, in fact, in which reproduction and sexuality have not always been coincidental with one another. You can't say this about most parts of the world. You cannot say this about any parts of the world in which Christianity is paramount or in which Judaism is paramount. But in this part of the world, where you have other religions and other cultures mingling, we can say with quite a deal of certainty that reproduction and sexuality were not in fact seen as being absolutely wedded to one another. And so one of those ways, of course, is to go back to being more traditional than we are right now and say, actually, there's no relation between having sex and having children. So I'm going to do the one without doing the other, right? That's sort of one possible way of saying, I'm going to disentangle sexuality from reproduction. Another way of doing this, of course, is to just to examine, say, two parallel related phenomena, specifically in India, where you have right now in the Rajya Sabha, pending its approval, after the Lok Sabha has already approved it, the surrogacy regulation bill, which basically aims to ban all commercial surrogacy. So again, once again, women cannot make money off their bodies. And says that you can only have altruistic surrogacy, which will not be paid. So your sister or your daughter or your, not daughter, I guess, your sister or your sister-in-law or cousin or whoever it is, I've lost track of the number of oppressed women. One of them is going to have your child for you and is not going to get paid on the one hand, right? So getting rid of surrogacy, which might mean getting rid of the importance of reproduction, just sort of finds its way back by saying, no, it's only women who in your family can do it, on the one hand. On the other hand, the absolute and almost insurmountable roadblocks that are placed in the way of adoption. So if you say, you know, the number of children in India who are waiting to be adopted is huge, but there is such a deep-seated belief in this kind of, as I said earlier, this genetic code of saying it's my genes that have to be passed on, my blood that has to be passed on, that unless we stop thinking about sexuality in terms of some kind of purity of genes and purity of blood and purity of affect, we're going to have a hard time separating it from reproduction.
Yeah. So this next question I'm going to pose to both of you. It's a combination of a couple of different questions we received, but I think all of them are invested in sort of something we were talking about briefly earlier, which is, do we need to, or why do we need to separate sex and love? And is there any strategic value in a country like India claiming that, you know, especially if your desire is non-normative, if you sort of use that tag of love to at least socially legitimize whatever that desire may be? Or does that do perhaps more harm than good? So how do we think about the difference between the two? Why do we even think about the difference between the two?
I was hoping I was quiet because I thought you might step in.
I will, but after you.
I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but I'll try. Well, of course, people experience love, but I mean, love also has a history. It's not that, it's not some natural fact. Right? I mean, it has a specific history. In the modern times, has a specific history. So there's a whole industry that is built around love. So I mean, I wouldn't want to think that if someone does not, of course, there's a lot of pressure on people also to experience love. Right? So if you say, for example, that you haven't experienced love, you're looked down upon as someone who is perhaps abnormal, someone missed out on something very, very remarkable. But that's also because, of course, love has it's produced at different sites, through cards, Valentine's Day cards, through cinema, through novels, etc., etc. So it's not, and through, of course, folk tales and stuff like that. So on the one hand, of course, I wouldn't want to think that that it is love is some out there and it's always been out there. You know, we don't. I mean, there are histories of love, but the histories tell us, of course, that love has a specific history itself. Now, secondly, I don't really have a problem in terms of differentiating between love and desire, and I don't think there is a necessary connection between saying that you have desire for someone or something without necessarily having love for that thing. Although in the Indian context, that's often considered wrong because, I mean, despite the fact that in many relationships, the both are not necessarily linked. So I think quite often a value is placed on the fact that love is the proper means to desire. But I don't really have just off the top of my head, I don't see a problem in terms of either differentiating between the two or linking the two depending on the context. I mean, I don't, just as for example, it's not natural for every woman to feel that she must be a mother, and that if you're not a mother, you missed out on something, because of course the ideas of motherhood that themselves produce. Or it's not natural for every woman to say that if you've given birth to someone, she must feel motherly love towards. Many women don't and are chastised or stigmatized for it. But of course, these are ideas that are produced. So similarly, the ideas of love are produced, and some people experience it, and then it leads to desire. Some people don't experience it, and then also it leads to desire. I think I don't really, I mean, I would, sort of answer it by saying I don't really see it as a problem to disconnect the two. And I don't think that anyone should feel particularly less for it by totally experiencing desire towards someone rather than also experiencing love. But just as I think the two can be linked. I mean, that's one way of answering it. If that is what the question is about, is there a problem if the two are not linked? I don't think there's a problem. I mean, the problem is not whether the two are linked or not. The problem is, what is that relationship about? That is the problem. It's not a problem. That's problematic. That's a question we need to think about.
Manjari, correct me if I'm wrong, but the terms were love and sex.
Yeah, it said love and sex.
Love and sex, right? Which I think would be slightly different. To go back to Sanjay's earlier response, actually, about when Sanjay, you were talking about your method as an anthropologist and how it's hard to ask people what their desire is, and it's easier to ask people what they love or who they love. And of course, the irony about that in India, when you say how love is the acceptable term, whereas desire is not, or sex is not. The irony of that in India, of course, is that this is a country in which the very term love marriage connotes desire. And it connotes desire because it goes against a certain kind of socially sanctioned norm. But it can only be translated in the terminology of love. And that, for me, is always what is interesting about that relationship between love and sex, which is why I sort of always prefer to use the word sex to using the word love, because love allows us to sublimate and sentimentalize sex, right? It allows us to sort of try and put a polite veneer on something that is much more chaotic, on something that is much more antisocial, on something that is actually the thing primed to go against the norms of society. Whereas love is sort of a very prettified version of increasingly now, the more modern you are, the more you will fall in love, or the more you will love someone or something, precisely because that's the acceptable face of desire, whereas sex becomes the unacceptable face of desire. And so for me, it's always sort of politically more important to think about and to take seriously the unacceptable face. And so for me, sex is much more sort of interesting a word to think about, interesting a word to grapple with, because love has been rendered so anodyne. It's been rendered so sentimentalized that you cannot think about it outside that structure of sentimentality. In fact, it's the word that that sort of gives you an easy pass, let's not. And for instance, in the aftermath of the 377 judgment, which of course, not of course, but which we all celebrated, but the whole conversation immediately shifted to gay love, immediately shifted to love, and what is wrong with love. And even before the judgment, the sort of rhetoric was all about love. And my argument with that is, well, the law is not penalizing you because of love. The law is penalizing you because of how and with whom you had sex. And that is what we need to talk about. And that is what we need to take seriously. Not say, oh, let us sound exactly like you, and then will you allow us to join your fold? We have to stand outside that fold and say, we are not going to join the bandwagon of love, because really what we're talking about are the dangers, the risks, and the pleasures of sex.
Great. So I have about 2 more questions to go. One is about female homosociality, or the social relationships between women in, I think she says, matrilineal families, and sort of what it was like in pre-colonial times, how it sort of changed in post-colonial times. So if either of you can sort of comment on that.
Sanjay, do you want to, or should I?
Go ahead, I'll join you. Go ahead.
Okay. I mean, doesn't sound quite like a question. It just sort of sounds like a sentence with a rising inflection at the end, and a question mark. But, let us make a question out of it, right? Which is that shall we say what's happened to matrilineal societies pre and post-colonialism?
Sure, yes.
And again, that is a big question. There are multiple ways of addressing this. I'm glad the questioner used the word matrilineal rather than matriarchal, because that would have been a slightly different mode of answer, or would have demanded a different mode of answer. I mean, as I like to say, I come from a matrilineal system. I come from a matrilineal family, and the prime advice. So technically my name is my mother's name. Her family property passes on to me rather than to any phantasmatic brothers that I'm lucky I don't have. And so there is a way in which matrilineality to me seems to be the most normal thing to do. And so it was, it's a bit startling to realize that for most people, that's not the norm. For me, the biggest advantage of matrilineality or a matrilineal system is certainly pre-colonial, which is that in matrilineal societies like mine, women did not get married. None of my female ancestors got married. They would have sex with men of their choice. And the way in which you knew they were having a sexual encounter any night was the man's umbrella and his slippers would be outside the house. And so other men would know not to enter that particular house that particular evening. The reason why women in matrilineal structures did not feel the need to get married is because if you get married for economic growth, or if you get married for the reproduction of your name, women in matrilineal societies already had both the name and the money. So they did not need a man around for anything, except perhaps for sperm donation, right, should they so desire. And so women in matrilineal societies did not get married, which for me is the big, huge advantage that we seem pretty much to have entirely lost now. Because now we are so cloaked, literally, in this shroud of British morality. The British, again, were so horrified by the sort of, section of Malabar Nayars who did not get married and who were matrilineal, that they sort of introduced an entire sort of marriage act to make sure that we did get married, many versions of which were rejected. But then now it is the law in India, right? That if you are not married, your children don't get certain rights, your partners don't get certain rights. Now they sort of say, well, if you've been in a live-in relationship under the same roof with a person for a certain number of years, then you will get certain rights. But of course, the pre-colonial matrilineal societies, you did not have to live under the same roof. You did not have to, in fact, sort of say, this man has equal rights in my children, or whatever it is. It was a much freer system. Which is not to say that there weren't sort of patriarchal inflections, because technically, of course, the mother's brother was the one who looked after a lot of the property, who administered a lot of the property. But still, the name and the property was always through the mother's line. We have completely lost that now with the sort of British insistence not only on everyone getting married, but on everyone having what is so transparently called a surname, right? Your father's name. Everyone has to have a surname. Luckily, the south of India is still fairly resistant to that idea. And so, although even people who sort of resist caste names or sort of patriarchal clan names will inevitably take their father's first name as their last name. So, defeating the idea of resisting patriarchy in that sense. But there is a sense in which we have lost a lot of those ideas that were part and parcel of matrilineality before the British came and legally and socially shamed us into behaving and adhering to a certain code.
Right. Sanjay, you want to add something to that?
There's not much to add. I think that's just about covers everything, including the very important fact that that people often sometimes think of it as kind of an Indian feminist utopia, which it wasn't necessarily, because as Madhavi said, the mother's mother was a very important male figure in terms of decision making. And I think the only thing I'd like to add is, of course, the so-called reform of this family form is undertaken by the Nair community itself. Of course, the British might have encouraged it, but they themselves said, well, this is terrible. Our family forms should not be like this. Our family forms actually where the father, there's a man of the house and he's the one who takes decisions. And what is this kind of, what are these strange ways where women can, they have multiple partners, and that's not a good family form. So the Nair reforms was, of course, undertaken by various such societies, reform societies formed by the Nairs themselves. And I think it's also important just also to remember, I think as also Madhavi also mentioned, that matrilineal is not matriarchy. Right? It's not about power. It's about transfer. It's about transfer of property. And as much as that can be converted into some notion of women being in a strong position, and property is fundamental to, in the context in which we live, is fundamental to having autonomy and decision and the capacity to make decisions, then obviously that was a good thing. But again, with the caveats, and Madhavi also mentioned that, to remember the role of the male, the mother's brother in particular, and then who eventually undertook this reform of this aberrant form of marriage, which was Nair men. So.
And anglicized Nair men who had sort of bought into this idea that the Christian family structure was the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah. So my last question, and I'm going to quote this question, and you'll know exactly why. It says, please suggest some of the seminal books which a beginner in sexuality studies or queer studies should read. Of course, part of the joy of reading out that question is, getting to declare that the word seminal comes from the word semen or seed. But that fun fact aside, I'm going to come to you first, Sanjay, because you do actually have a book on sexuality and masculinity called Sexual Sites and Seminal Attitudes, if I'm not wrong. But you can interpret the word seminal to mean whatever you like, and name a few seminal books as asked.
I don't actually like naming, the title of the books were meant to be ironic, right? Because the whole notion of it's really very difficult to say that this is there are a number of books I think people should read, a number of edited collections that are important. And also, I think I'm wary of naming any sort of 2 or 3 books because it does injustice, I think, to the area of study, and also the fact that different cultural and regional contexts require you, if you're really interested in, to read widely. Otherwise, what has happened, of course, is that a lot of, till very recently, our studies of these kinds of topics was largely something that was derived from Western ideas of sexuality, etc., etc. So I'm really very wary, and I can't even begin to think where I would start, except for naming the usual suspects, which I think is a problem. So I could say, like, I don't know, Foucault, but I don't think it does justice, because I don't necessarily agree that while these ideas are fundamental to thinking about certain things, that they're necessarily something that you can apply in all its totality to the Indian context or the non-Western context. So I'm really wary. I think that what we could do is perhaps send you a list, and if people are interested, they could in the interest of time, they could ask, you could pass on the list, which would be a full list. And my reason is simply because I think that there is no one universal capitalism, there's no universal culture of sexuality. So it would be odd for me to say, read these 4 books and you'll understand. So I'll leave it at that. And I mean that not as a rhetorical point, but as a serious point in terms of how to understand this topic, which is that I cannot name 2 or 3 books. I could, but I don't think it would do justice to the topics.
I think Sanjay is being modest. I think to whoever the questioner is, you should read all his books as for starters. But no, I completely agree. There are, you can start from anywhere. And really the sort of dirty secret about sexuality is that any book you read can be about sexuality. And any book that you read can be about desire. And so you need to read as widely as possible. But certainly I would say that if you want sort of a few titles that you think are absolutely necessary, to my mind, I still think one of the best I mean, you can go through sort of Freud and Foucault and the Kama Sutra and Mir and Ghalib, and I think all those are important. But I really think Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, which is her earliest one, and so not always the one that is touted as her most famous one, is a very, very, very good introduction just to thinking about the problems that then reading all these other texts around might help you to address.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you both. We're all out of time now. But thank you to you and our audience for joining us and sticking with us during what you called nap time, Madhavi.
Yes, the time. Yeah, I know. Thanks, Manjari. Thanks, Sanjay. This was an absolute pleasure being in conversation.
Thank you to our organizers as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly. Thanks very much. Thanks, Nitya. I see you're back.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Manjari. This was an incredible panel. So thank you all.